I never thought silence could be so loud. It's been 8 months since Richard died, and yet the house still carries his voice in every creak of the floorboards, in the way the wind sighs through the kitchen window he never got around to fixing. I keep expecting to hear his footsteps, that low, steady rhythm that once felt like the safest sound in the world. But the silence now has a weight. It presses on me, makes the air heavier. Maybe that's what happens when you live with someone for 42 years and then suddenly, you don't. We didn't have children. Not because we didn't want them, but because life decided otherwise. So when Richard passed, a heart attack on an ordinary Tuesday morning, it left me truly, completely alone. Or at least, that's what I thought. The first time I noticed the flowers, I didn't think much of it. It was early April, still cold enough that my breath came out in clouds when I walked to the cemetery. I brought fresh tulips, Richard's favorite. But when I reached his grave, there was already a small bouquet there, pale yellow roses wrapped in brown paper. I assumed someone from his past had stopped by. Maybe an old colleague, maybe a childhood friend. But the next day, they were there again. And the day after that. Always fresh. Always carefully arranged. Always pale yellow roses. I started asking around, the neighbors, the few old acquaintances Richard still had before he passed. But everyone looked at me like I'd asked about ghosts. Roses? No, Margaret, none of us have been, said Henry, Richard's last surviving colleague. To be honest, I thought you were the only one visiting. By mid-May, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to those flowers. Someone was coming to his grave. Someone who knew him well enough to know about the roses. And yet, there wasn't supposed to be anyone left. One night, I sat in the kitchen, sipping cold tea, and opened his old wooden desk drawer, the one he always kept locked. The key had been in his watch case. I'd never thought to open it before. Richard was a private man, and I respected that privacy. Or maybe I was afraid of what I'd find. Inside were bank statements, a passport, and a thin envelope with a name I didn't recognize, Clara Whitmore. It meant nothing to me then. But I should have known. I decided to go to the cemetery earlier than usual the next morning, before sunrise, hoping to catch whoever was leaving the flowers. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as I made my way through the misty rows of gravestones. And then I saw her. A woman, maybe in her late 40s, standing by Richard's grave with a bouquet of those same yellow roses. Her long dark coat brushed against the damp grass, and her hair, chestnut, glossy, beautiful, was tied back in a simple knot. She looked calm. Sad, but calm. I froze behind a tree, unsure if I should approach. But then she placed the flowers down gently, almost tenderly, and whispered something I couldn't make out. When she turned to leave, our eyes met. And for a moment, I thought I was looking at a ghost. Because she had Richard's smile. "Can I help you?" she asked softly, as though I were the intruder. I should be asking you that," I managed to stammer, stepping closer. "I'm Margaret. Richard's wife." Something flickered across her face then, surprise, guilt, maybe both. She hesitated before answering. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "I'm Clara." The name from the envelope. My stomach dropped. I don't understand," I whispered. "How do you know my husband?" Her gaze didn't falter. "Because I was his wife too." The rest of her words blurred. I stood there, numb, as if the cold had seeped into my bones. According to Clara, Richard had been living a second life for over 2 decades. When he told me he was working night shifts at the plant, he was spending those nights in another house. With her. He had 2 children. A son and a daughter. Both grown. And when he died, he left everything to them. The house. The car. The savings I thought were ours. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, staring at her, the weight of 42 years crashing down on me in a single moment. I thought I knew my husband. I thought I knew my life. But standing there, on the damp grass of his grave, watching the woman who had shared his love, his secrets, and his children, I realized I had been living with a stranger. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in our bed. His side was still neatly made, untouched since the morning he died, and now it felt like a monument to a man I never really knew. I sat by the window instead, staring at the yellow streetlights bleeding into the fog. And for the first time since Richard's death, I wasn't grieving him anymore. I was grieving myself. Because whoever Margaret had been, Richard's wife, his partner, his only love, she didn't exist. She had never existed. For 3 nights after meeting Clara, I didn't sleep. I'd sit in the living room surrounded by photo albums, touching each picture as though they could speak, as though they could explain what I'd missed. There we were on our wedding day, Richard's arm around me, his smile wide, his hand resting on mine. That smile had been hers too. Every laugh, every gentle brush of his hand on my shoulder, had he given the same gestures to her? Did he call her by the same pet names he whispered in my ear when the world felt unbearable? The thought made me nauseous. I called our lawyer the next morning. His voice carried the weight of quiet pity. "Yes, Margaret," he said softly, "the will is valid. Everything was transferred to Clara and their children months ago. There's nothing to contest." Months ago. Before I even knew she existed. I thanked him, hung up, and stared at the wall for a long time. My hands felt cold and useless in my lap. That's when the anger came. It came suddenly, roaring through me like a storm tearing apart a coastline. I grabbed the nearest frame, our anniversary photo, and hurled it against the wall. The glass shattered, raining down like sharp little stars. For the first time in 42 years, I hated Richard. I went back to the cemetery the next day, hoping Clara would be there again. Hoping she'd give me something more than fragments of truth. She was there, kneeling by his grave with her roses. I didn't wait this time. I walked straight up to her. "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice cracked, half whisper, half accusation. Clara glanced up, startled, then sighed as though she'd been expecting me. "Because I thought you knew," she said softly. "I thought, you must have agreed to it somehow." "Agreed?" My voice rose. "Agreed to being lied to? To being replaced? To wasting my entire life on a man who had another home? Another family?" Her expression softened, but her eyes stayed steady. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I truly am. But Richard loved us both." I almost laughed. Loved us both? He lied to us both. That's not love, Clara. That's cowardice. Something in her gaze shifted, a flicker of guilt, or maybe shame. She didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and handed me a folded piece of paper. "I wasn't going to give this to you," she whispered, "but maybe you need it more than I do." It was a letter. In Richard's handwriting. I unfolded it carefully, my fingers trembling. "Margaret. If you're reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to tell you myself. I wanted to protect you from pain, but I've probably caused you more than I'll ever know. Clara and the children, they were never meant to take anything from you. I thought I had time to make things right, but time ran out. I loved you. God, I loved you. You were my safe place, my anchor. But Clara was my escape, my mistake that stopped feeling like one. Forgive me, if you can. And if you can't, I'll understand." I read it twice, 3 times. The words blurred, my tears making the ink run like watercolors. Safe place. Anchor. Escape. I didn't know which hurt more, that he'd betrayed me, or that some part of him had still loved me while he did it. "Did you know about this?" I asked, voice raw. Clara nodded slowly. "I found my letter too. It didn't make it easier." I stared at her, really stared this time. She was 20 years younger than me, yes, but she carried the same grief etched into her face, the same hollowness in her eyes. We were both living in Richard's shadow. Two women bound by the same man, trapped in different halves of the same lie. I wanted to hate her. I tried. But standing there, surrounded by the stillness of the cemetery, I realized Clara wasn't my enemy. Richard was. That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the good kind Richard used to save for special occasions, and sat by the window again. I thought about all the nights I'd waited for him, dinner cooling on the table, believing he was working late. I thought about the times I'd reached across the bed and found only cold sheets. And now, knowing the truth, I wondered how much of my life had been real. Had he ever truly been mine? The next morning, I made a decision. I needed to know everything. Not just about Clara. Not just about the children. I needed to know who Richard really was. I began with the bank statements from his locked drawer. There were transfers I couldn't explain, withdrawals from accounts I didn't recognize. I called the bank pretending to be settling estate matters and pieced together fragments of his financial life. That's when I discovered it. For over 20 years, Richard had been paying for a second house. Not Clara's, she'd confirmed that already. Another one. Somewhere I'd never heard of. And that was when I realized. There were more secrets. More than Clara. More than the children. More than I was ready for. The address was scribbled in Richard's handwriting on the back of one of the bank statements. A simple line of numbers and street names. I stared at it for hours before finally deciding to go. The house was in a quiet neighborhood about 30 miles away, a place I'd never had reason to visit. The drive there felt endless, every turn heavier than the last. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When I finally pulled up, I almost didn't believe what I saw. It wasn't just a house. It was beautiful. A 2-story brick home with green shutters, white trim, and a front garden that looked carefully maintained. A swing hung from an old oak tree out front. Everything about it screamed lived in. Someone was still here. I parked 2 houses down and watched. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then, the front door opened, and a young woman stepped out, carrying a toddler on her hip. I couldn't breathe. She couldn't have been more than 30. Her hair, dark and soft-looking, spilled past her shoulders. She glanced around the street cautiously before walking to her car and strapping the child into the back seat. She didn't look like Clara. She didn't look like me. Who was she? And what was Richard to her? I waited until she drove away before approaching the house. My reflection stared back at me from the polished glass of the door. For a moment, I hesitated. What if she came back? What if someone called the police? But my need to know overpowered my fear. I checked under the doormat on instinct, and there it was. A key. Richard always kept one under our mat too. He was predictable that way. The lock clicked softly, and I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender and freshly baked bread. Sunlight spilled through the curtains, warming the hardwood floors. There were toys scattered near the couch, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, and framed photographs on the walls. I moved closer to one and froze. It was Richard. Younger than I remembered him, smiling down at the camera, holding a baby in his arms. My throat tightened, and I reached for the frame with trembling hands. There were more, one of him and the young woman on a beach, laughing, her head resting on his shoulder. Another of him teaching a little boy how to ride a bike. I stumbled back, my stomach churning. This wasn't just another affair. This was another family. The sound of footsteps behind me made my heart leap into my throat. "Who are you?" a voice demanded. I turned to see the young woman standing in the doorway, a grocery bag dangling from one hand. Her expression shifted from confusion to recognition in an instant. "You're Margaret, aren't you?" Her voice was soft, almost timid. I nodded, unable to form words. She sighed and set the bag down on the counter, leaning against it for support. "I wondered when you'd find out," she murmured. "Who are you?" My voice cracked on the words. My name is Emily, she said quietly. I was Richard's partner. I swallowed hard. Partner? She hesitated, then met my gaze. He was the father of my son. I stared at her, struggling to breathe. How old? I whispered. 3, she said. We met 8 years ago. 8 years. I had thought Richard's betrayals were over, contained neatly within Clara and the life he'd hidden there. But this was something else entirely. Emily stepped closer, her expression softening. I didn't know about you, she said. Not until after he died. He told me he was divorced. He said Clara was an ex-girlfriend. He lied to me too. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it all. He left you anything? Her face twisted bitterly. Nothing. Not a cent. This house isn't even mine, he bought it, but it's in some company's name. The bank owns it now. I sank into a chair, my legs too weak to hold me. Richard had been splitting his life 3 ways, with me, with Clara, with Emily, and somehow none of us had known about the others. Emily sat across from me, her hands trembling as she smoothed the hem of her sweater. He told me he worked long hours to take care of us, she said softly. Sometimes he wouldn't come home for days. Now I know why. I thought of all those nights I'd waited for him, dinner cold on the table. We sat there in silence for a long time, 2 strangers bound together by a man who'd woven lies so carefully we'd built our lives on them. Finally, Emily looked at me, her eyes wide with something like fear. There's something else, she whispered. Something you should know. My chest tightened. What? She hesitated, glancing toward a drawer in the kitchen. Slowly, she pulled it open and retrieved a small black notebook. I found this after he died, she said, sliding it toward me. It's full of names. Women's names. Dozens of them. I didn't recognize any except Clara's. And now yours. I opened the notebook with shaking hands. Page after page, name after name, carefully written in Richard's neat, controlled handwriting. Next to each was a date. Some went back 30 years. My skin went cold. I left the house that day with the notebook clutched to my chest, my heart pounding so loudly I thought I might faint. When I got home, I locked the door, closed the curtains, and sat on the floor, flipping through the pages. The more I read, the clearer it became. Richard had been living a life none of us understood. A life full of secrets. A life full of shadows. A life I was only beginning to uncover. And somehow, deep in my gut, I knew. The flowers on his grave had nothing to do with Clara. I used to believe love made us better. That it softened our edges, made us kinder, more patient, more human. But after Richard, I wasn't so sure anymore. The night I found Emily, I went home and poured myself a glass of wine, then another. The clock ticked softly in the background, mocking me with its calm rhythm, while my world felt like it had collapsed. I thought about Clara, the woman I had once despised and now couldn't stop thinking about. I thought about Emily, her soft voice and haunted eyes, and the little boy who would grow up never knowing the full truth about his father. And I thought about Richard. Always Richard. I hated him. God, I hated him for what he'd done. But the hate lived right next to something else, something uglier, heavier, harder to admit. I still loved him. That was the real betrayal, wasn't it? That my heart hadn't caught up with my mind. That even now, knowing everything, I still longed for him in the quiet moments, the weight of his hand on mine, the warmth of his laugh, the way he used to kiss me when he thought no one was watching. How do you grieve someone who wasn't yours to begin with? A week later, Clara called me. I think we should talk, she said, her voice low and careful. Not at the cemetery. Somewhere private. I agreed, though part of me dreaded seeing her. We met at a small cafe near the edge of town. When I walked in, she was already there, her hands folded neatly around a cup of tea. She looked younger than me, fresher somehow, but there was no smugness in her eyes. Only exhaustion. "I've been thinking," she said when I sat down. "About all of this. About us." "Us?" I almost laughed. She nodded. "Whether we like it or not, Margaret, we're part of each other's lives now." He made sure of that. I stared at her, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue before speaking. "He told me you were his escape." Clara flinched, then gave a small, sad smile. "He told me the same thing, about you." For a moment, we just looked at each other, two women bound together by the same lie. "Do you ever wonder," Clara whispered, "if any of it was real? If he loved either of us, or if we were just convenient halves of the same man?" I swallowed hard, staring down at my untouched coffee. "Every day." Then she said something I wasn't prepared for. "He never lied to me about passion." I glanced up sharply, heat rising to my face. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "He made me feel alive, Margaret. Like I was the only woman in the world. I think that's why I stayed, even after I knew about you. Even after I hated myself for it." The words cut deeper than I expected. Because suddenly, memories came rushing back, the way Richard used to look at me in our early years, before the distance crept in, before the nights away became normal. I remembered the touch of his hands, his breath warm against my neck, the wild kind of love that once kept me awake at night. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost that man. Or maybe, he'd simply given that part of himself to someone else. "I used to think," I said slowly, "that what we had was enough. The quiet evenings, the shared routines, the comfort of knowing each other so well. I thought that was love." "It was," Clara said softly. "For you, it was. But for Richard," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I think he needed more. The thrill. The passion. The kind of love that burns instead of settles. And you gave him that," I whispered. She didn't deny it. I hated her for a heartbeat, then hated myself for blaming her at all. Richard had made his choices. We'd both just been living inside them. When I got home that night, I sat on the edge of my bed and opened Richard's letter again. I traced his words with my fingertips, rereading the part where he'd called me his safe place. Safe. Anchor. Home. But never fire. I wondered if that had been my failure, or his. The next day, I drove past the house where Emily lived. I told myself I wasn't going to stop, but I parked anyway. She was outside with her son, kneeling in the grass as he laughed and clutched a small toy car. For a moment, I imagined Richard there too, his arms around Emily, his lips brushing her cheek, his laughter mixing with theirs. The image burned me from the inside out. I sat in the car until my chest ached from holding my breath, then finally drove away. That night, I dreamed of Richard. He was young again, the way he'd looked when we first met. He stood in the kitchen, smiling at me, holding out his hand. But when I reached for him, he stepped back, disappearing into a fog where Clara's silhouette waited, and beyond her, Emily's. I woke up with tears on my pillow. Weeks passed, but the ache didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. Everywhere I turned, I saw reminders of the man I thought I'd loved and the man he really was. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something that terrified me. I didn't know which man I missed more. The one who belonged to me, or the one who didn't. The next time Clara called me, her voice sounded different. Tighter. Sharper. "I need to see you," she said. "It's important." We met at her house this time, the one Richard had bought for her and the children. I'd never been inside before. It was beautiful. Warm. Lived in. A home filled with the pieces of a life I didn't know existed. There were photos everywhere, Richard smiling, Richard holding a baby, Richard with his arm around Clara, his lips pressed to her temple. I hated those photos. Not because of what they showed, but because of how happy he looked in them. Clara led me into the kitchen and poured us both coffee. She didn't sit. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed tightly. I found something, she said, sliding an envelope toward me. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Handwritten in Richard's neat, careful script. They're from him, Clara explained, her voice low. I found them hidden in an old box in the attic. I picked one up, my fingers trembling. Clara. I can't stop thinking about you. About last night. About the way you laugh when I kiss your neck. You make me feel young again, alive in a way I thought I'd forgotten. I wish I could give you more of me, but my life, it's complicated. I need time. Just a little more time. I dropped the letter like it burned me. I'd spent 42 years believing I was Richard's everything, his one constant, his anchor. But here, in Clara's kitchen, I was reading proof that she had been the one to wake something in him I hadn't touched in decades. My throat tightened, and I looked at Clara. Why are you showing me this? Because, she whispered, I need you to know I didn't take him from you. He came to me. I walked out before she could say another word. I drove aimlessly for hours, the roads blurring beneath me, the letters replaying in my head like cruel echoes. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard's face, smiling, passionate, alive. The Richard in those letters wasn't the man I'd shared a bed with. That man had grown quiet, practical, tired. But this Richard, Clara's Richard, was wild, hungry, desperate for something more than comfort. And that hurt more than the betrayal itself. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I traced the faint lines at the corners of my eyes, the softness of my jaw, the silver threads in my hair. Was this why he'd gone to her? Because she was younger, fresher, unmarked by time? I hated myself for thinking it, but the thought gnawed at me until I felt hollow. And then another thought crept in, darker, more dangerous. If I'd given him the passion he wanted, would he have stayed? A few days later, Clara came to me. I almost didn't open the door, but something in her expression stopped me. She looked broken. I'm sorry, she whispered before I could speak. I shouldn't have shown you the letters. It wasn't fair. Her voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw past my anger to the woman standing in front of me, a woman who had loved Richard as fiercely as I had. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything between us pressing down like a storm about to break. Finally, she spoke. Did he ever hold you the way he held me? I stared at her, stunned. What? In the letters, she said softly. He wrote about how he couldn't breathe when he was with me. About how his body burned for me. I keep wondering, did he ever feel that way with you? I wanted to scream at her. To hate her. To throw her out of my house and out of my life. But instead, I whispered, he used to. And just like that, the silence shattered between us. We talked for hours that night, trading pieces of Richard like broken glass. We compared memories, laughed bitterly at the lies, cried over the truths. And somewhere in the exhaustion of it all, I realized something neither of us wanted to admit. We weren't rivals anymore. We were survivors. But there was still Emily. Neither of us knew what she truly meant to Richard, whether she was another love, another escape, or simply another life he couldn't resist building. Clara said she wanted to meet her. I wasn't sure I could handle that. That night, I dreamed of Richard again. Only this time, it wasn't our early years. It wasn't laughter or stolen kisses. I dreamed of him standing between Clara and me, holding out his hands like he could keep us both. And when I reached for him, he stepped back into the fog and disappeared. I woke up gasping, the taste of his name on my lips. It was Clara who arranged the meeting. Emily deserves to know, she said on the phone, her voice steady but fragile. And so do we. I almost said no. I wasn't ready, not to face another woman who had loved him, not to hear more pieces of a life I'd never been a part of. But something inside me whispered that if I didn't do this now, I'd carry these shadows forever. We met in a park near the river. The air smelled of rain, and the sound of distant traffic hummed like a restless heartbeat. Emily was already there when I arrived, her little boy playing in the grass nearby. She looked younger than I remembered, her beauty almost careless, unburdened by years of compromise the way mine had been. Clara stood beside her, arms folded tightly, like she was holding herself together by force. For a moment, none of us spoke. It was Emily who finally broke the silence. "I didn't know about you," she said softly, looking straight at me. "Either of you." Her voice trembled, and I could tell she meant it. "I believe you," I said quietly. And I did. We sat on a worn wooden bench, three women tied together by the same man and yet strangers to each other's pain. "I thought I was his only one," Emily whispered, staring at her hands. "He told me he was divorced. That his past was complicated, but behind him. He promised me everything." Clara let out a soft, bitter laugh. "He promised me everything too." I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The little boy ran up to Emily, laughing, and threw himself into her arms. She hugged him tightly, burying her face in his hair. My chest ached watching them. That child was innocent, and yet he was a living reminder of all the nights Richard hadn't come home to me. Clara was the one who finally asked the question we'd all been circling around. "Do you think he loved us?" Silence. I stared at the river, watching the current pull away leaves and twigs as though it swallowed every secret we'd ever carried. "Yes," I said at last, my voice quiet but sure. "He loved us. All of us. Just, not enough to choose one life." After Emily left with her son, Clara and I stayed behind. The weight of everything between us pressed heavy on the damp air. "You know," Clara said after a while, "sometimes I think I should hate you." I looked at her, startled. "Why?" "Because you had him first," she said simply. "Because you were the one he called his anchor. The one he went home to, even when he lied about where he'd been." I thought about it, about all the nights I'd waited up, the dinners gone cold, the quiet resignation that had crept into my bones long before I ever knew why. "You shouldn't hate me," I said softly. "You should hate him." Clara smiled sadly. "I've tried. But some nights. I still miss him." My throat tightened. "Me too." And for the first time, we didn't feel like enemies. We felt like survivors, two women who had loved the same man in different ways, and lost him all the same. That night, I went to the cemetery alone. The grass was damp beneath my shoes, and the wind tugged at my coat as I made my way to his grave. There were yellow roses there again. Fresh, perfect, still dewy from the morning. I stood there for a long time, staring down at his name carved into cold stone. "You gave me half a life, Richard," I whispered. "Half a man. Half the truth. And I loved you like you were whole." My voice cracked, and I covered my mouth with trembling fingers. "I don't know how to forgive you," I said softly. "But I don't know how to stop loving you either." For the first time, I let myself cry, not quiet, controlled tears, but deep, shaking sobs that tore through me until there was nothing left. And when the tears finally stopped, the silence felt different. Lighter. As if somewhere inside me, something had let go. Weeks turned into months. I stopped going to the cemetery every day. I planted tulips in the garden, the way Richard used to love. I donated his clothes, his books, his little collection of vinyl records he'd once sworn he'd never part with. Clara called sometimes. So did Emily. Strange as it was, we became each other's lifelines, women who knew better than anyone else what it meant to love a man who belonged to too many people. One evening, Clara said something that stayed with me. "We may never know who he was, Margaret." "Not really. But we can decide who we are without him." And for the first time since his death, I realized I had that choice. The last time I visited his grave, I brought no flowers. I stood there, hands in my pockets, and whispered, "Goodbye, Richard." The wind carried my words away, soft and weightless, like something finally released. As I walked back toward the gates, I didn't look over my shoulder. Because for the first time in 42 years, my life was mine.